Hello, I'm Dr. Carol Billing from the University of Idaho, and today we're going to talk briefly about Standard 1, Knowledge of Subject Matter. So these standards are the benchmarks that your teacher prep program needs to achieve in order to produce highly effective teachers. So in the first standard, we're focusing on knowledge of subject matter. Now, it would be really odd if I tried to teach you your subject matter, because obviously you're coming into the classroom having experience in construction or culinary or something related to family consumer science or business like I was. So that's not what I'm going to cover today. We're going to talk a little bit about how we take that experience, life experience that you have, and what it means to add that to becoming a career and technical teacher. All right, so in this slide, I think the most important thing to understand is that you can be coming into both secondary and post-secondary education. You're preparing students for the world of work, and that you're probably in one of these areas: ag, business, family, FCS, marketing, health, trade, industry, engineering, comm, or tech ed. So to break down the standard, we want to define what knowledge means, and I think this is pretty self-explanatory, and that you're already coming in with knowledge. And subject matter is somewhat the same. You know what your area of study is. You've been doing it in the working world. And I expect that you're an expert because you've been handpicked to come in the classroom. It's because you've been identified as an expert in your content area. And what we're going to work on, or what you're going to work forward in learning now, is how do you take the skill you have and be able to teach it to others. So throughout this presentation, if you feel like you need to stop on the slide and read it, feel free to pause. There are 33 slides, and I think that's a lot, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on slides where I feel like they're somewhat self-explanatory. So in your, this is probably the most important slide because it talks about what you need to learn now. So you have your content area or subject matter expert, and unless you've had teaching in the past, these areas are somewhat new. You're going to be learning how to teach. What are the methods of instruction or teaching strategies? You're going to learn how to develop curriculum. You're going to create assessments of students. So that's in the old days, we called those quizzes or tests or something like that. But in your field, it's probably going to be more performance-based. You'll find that even though you are teaching construction or culinary or FCS, you're going to do career guidance, and it's going to be both formally focused on your content area, but it's also going to be life guidance. It just happens in teaching. And then we also want you to know, the last bullet there, what is the history of CTE, or how did this even come about that you have this job? Like, where did this come from? And so I'll touch on that briefly, and I'll give you some resources in your free time to take a look at that would be helpful. So it's important that we model being a professional in the classroom. I know that you've been told that a lot, so I'm not going to harp on it. But that's a key component of your teaching, is the modeling of being a professional and adhering to professional standards. The teaching colleges, which is the University of Idaho and Idaho State University, have CTE teacher prep programs. And we have these standards that we meet that confirm that we're creating highly effective teachers. So these teaching standards, that's what we're going to focus on these presentations. So I'm going to talk about standards 1, 2, and 3, and in this video I'm just talking about number 1. But just so you have an understanding about standards, there are there's a lot. There are core standards, which is basic teaching, and then there are specific standards for CTE. And the standards 1, 2, and 3 I'm talking to you about are going to be specific foundational career CTE standards. These standards are divided into 3 parts. Do you know stuff? Can you perform it? And what is your disposition while doing it? And we're not going to go into that, but if you were to ever read them, that would help you understand how the standards are divided into kind of focused areas. Okay, very briefly I want to talk about how CTE came about. So there are several periods of time, and initially apprenticeship and trades were passed down father to son, but as the United States evolved, we needed to move into a more formalized education. These were the years when schools became created, and private schools offered some CTE training for women. We moved into the manual labor movement, which focused primarily on the means for paying for education, and it also gave respect to the industry. WW2 enhanced vocational education, especially with women coming into the workplace because the men were training. That's a key part of those years. And then most importantly, and what you're going to be affected by most, would be that the federal legislation to fund CTE programs came into play. And I'll talk a little bit more about funding at the end. Most of what you see today, we used to call CTE vocational ed classes. That's what it was called when I was in high school. And these are pretty true. If you are anywhere close to 40s or 50s, you remember the 80s maybe. And this is how vocational education was described. And it definitely was reduced enrollments in the 80s, and that had a lot to do with tracking. I remember my sister, who's graduated in 82, she was tracked into vocational ed, which was really funny because my parents had a completely different trajectory for her. She went to college. And so I think that 70s and 80s were really interesting because they did track students and into certain expectations. So that's kind of an interesting era. Okay. Moving on, we had some specific leaders and philosophers that affected CTE. Booker T. Washington, he was a founding president of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And he's a really interesting man. If you ever have the opportunity to read a book about him or listen to a book about him, I would highly recommend it. I have a website I'm going to share with you. Just a minute here. This is some information about him, and I will give you this link so that you can read it. But he had such a fascinating life, and the things he accomplished were really just amazing for the time. And he basically took the first step from changing education to being root memory, to being something that's problem solving and needing to use thinking. Sneed and Prosser are two other influential leaders during the CTE, development of CTE. And they emphasize the need to practice and think about what you're doing, and then do the actual act and think about what you're doing, which sounds so elementary. But if you think back to the years when they were alive, there was so much root memory. There was so much you just do something because someone told you. So their theory was unique and adopted strongly by CTE. And then the last one here is John Dewey, which is hands down my favorite. The thing I love about John Dewey is that he saw occupations as central to education. He thought every student would benefit from doing, not just learning. And a lot of his theory focuses on the can't just be told something. You have to experience it. And again, it seems like common sense, but at the time, and he came about before the other leaders that I just talked about. I would recommend anything on John Dewey. I think he's really fascinating, and I think I have a web page for that one also that I'm going to share with you. Oh no, it's Sneed, I think. Yeah, so this one, I'll throw this link in for you. But this was really interesting because it talks about Dewey and Sneeden and how their philosophies were a little bit different. And Dewey came before Sneeden, and I think it's not a long read, but you might want to take a look. All right, I just have a few slides on the legislation that supports CTE, and it's important that you're familiar with these. So the Morrill Act 1862 established land-grant universities. The University of Idaho is the land-grant university for the state of Idaho, and this was influential because it was the beginning of agricultural education, and which is a part of CTE, but it also sort of opened the door to all CTE education being developed. And this talked a little bit more about ag ed. It's also more ag ed. So this is important to know Smith Hughes because it provided the funding for CTE programs. And you can see the original funding was $3 million, which is pretty funny considering what it is now. The George Acts came in. They also started adding more funds and diversifying the programs. Vocational Act of 1963. So if you think about 63 and what all was going on in the world, or excuse me, in the United States, it makes sense that this vocational act came about. It added work-study programs. If you're familiar with those, it's kind of, well, they're important because they're giving more hands-on opportunities. And you see these more in four-year institutions, but that doesn't mean it wasn't applied differently. New equipment and facilities for existing programs, that's important. We all know how important that is for CTE. And then we had some amendments in the late 60s and early 70s to diversify and expand CTE offerings. Carl Perkins is probably the most important thing. If you remember anything from this presentation, you're going to be involved with Perkins funding. And so it began in '84. It's been updated multiple times, and they've shifted from vocational education to career and technical education, or CTE. Again, it's been modified. And Perkins 4 went through 2012. You see the name change. Sorry about that. I believe we're in Perkins 5 currently, and you will hear more about Perkins as you go through your career and your training. I think initially this first year you're going to want to focus on teaching well, so learning how to teach well, learning how to connect with students, learning how to navigate everything in your individual not institutions, but schools, locations, districts, that kind of stuff. That takes a year. I mean, sometimes it takes longer. While you're doing that, though, keep your ears open for things about Perkins and start to try to understand how the funding works, and then ask questions about it. When I taught high school, I didn't know anything about the funding, and I didn't know to ask. And so my principal handled all the funding, and I never had any control. So my advice would be to listen about Perkins, absorb as much as you can about Perkins to understand it, because it can be confusing. But your focus the first few years is getting your coursework dialed in, getting your curriculum solid, and learning how to teach and make connections with students, because that's the most important thing. And then I have one brief slide here on student organizations. My expectation will be that you'll be asked to either assist in these organizations at your schools or be the advisor for them. I'm the advisor for BPA, which is Business Professionals of America at the University of Idaho, so I'm very familiar with BPA specifically, and I'm going to give you my email so you can email me if you have questions about that. I've also been a judge at DECA and HOSA, and been a presenter and attended ACTE for many, many years. So if you have questions about those programs, I'm happy to help, especially if you are being tasked with starting a CTSO. These are called CTSOs, Career Technical Student Organizations. If you are asked to start one of these in your school, and maybe you're teaching at a really small school, I can help you understand your region, who's in your region, and give you some ideas about people to connect with to help you build that. That's probably the most important thing. And I can also help you with some realistic expectations for your first few years of advising a CTSO. Because I think sometimes we think it should be 20 kids and we should do state and nationals and all this. And that's great. You can definitely do that. But again, I want to circle back to your first focus these first few years is getting your curriculum solid, especially if you have to build it all yourself, like no one gave you anything from previous CTE teachers, or you're teaching a new program and learning how to connect with students. That's your first and primary focus. So I hope this video was a little bit helpful. 16 minutes, which is probably about 6 minutes longer than it probably needed to be. But it gives you a brief overview of CTE history, funding, and an introduction to CTSOs. And these are some aspects of your subject matter that you probably didn't bring from the working world, but you do need to have them, and at least a pretty good understanding of them, to be an effective CTE teacher. So again, I'll have my email available for you, and feel free to email, and we can Zoom or talk on the phone, whatever your preference is, and help you get started.